Hi folks, my name is Carl Lee and I'm what is known as a primitive technologist. Now, what does a primitive technologist do? Well, I study and make replicas of prehistoric tools, the tools that our ancestors would have been using through all periods of prehistory. And I started a company 20 years ago now called Primitive Technology UK, and I've been working with museums, universities and schools for most of that time, teaching and demonstrating these skills. Now, what we're going to do today, we're all stuck in lockdown because of the coronavirus, so I thought it would be nice to do some videos for school groups or school age primary school children to talk a little bit about prehistoric people and the way they lived. So I'm going to try and do that while I'm throwing in a few replica stone tools as well. So I'm going to make a fairly simple stone tool, and we'll just call this an introductory video, but I am going to be making more if you want to tune in and watch any of those. And I'm going to try and cover areas of the syllabus that you would have been covering at school. I know, boring, right? But I'm going to try and make it as interesting as possible. So I think we'd better start by introducing you to flint, because what I'm going to be doing is flint knapping. Now, flint is just a type of stone, a very special type of stone, and to knap is just a very old word meaning to break. And this is flint. If I can pick it up. Oh, there we go. That's a piece of flint. Now, this is nothing special. It's the kind of piece of flint that you'd expect to pick up in your garden if you live in the southeast of England, or maybe in a field while you're out walking the dogs. It doesn't have to be a brilliant piece of flint to start flint knapping. Flint only forms where we find chalk. So in Britain it's really restricted to the southeast of England, and we find some beautiful quality flint. This is from East Anglia, and you can see this nice black coloration to the flint. There's very few fossils in this. We find lots of fossils in flint, but they can be problematic. So if we can find a fossil-free piece of flint, we know it's going to be much easier to work than something that's just full of chalk and fossils. So, introduction, people, flint, flint, people. There you go, you've been introduced. Now, this piece is fairly high quality, and it would have almost certainly been picked up by a prehistoric person. It's perfect for making stone tools. And one of the reasons that flint was so important to our ancestors is that it breaks very easily. And when it does break, it produces beautiful sharp edges. And that was incredibly useful to our ancestors. And they were using flint for a very, very long time. They were using it from the Paleolithic period. So in Britain, we're looking at between 700,000 to 800,000 years ago, almost 1,000,000 years ago. And they started making fairly simple tools like this. Simple, what we would call flake tools. And these have nice sharp edges, and they're perfect for cutting things up. And of course, one of the things that they were cutting up most was animals, because they didn't have a Tesco's. They didn't have a butcher's. And even the posh prehistoric people didn't have a Waitrose. So, if they wanted to eat meat, they had to go and kill the animals themselves. They were hunting them, and once they'd hunted the animals, they had to cut them up to get the meat. And that's the kind of thing that they would have started butchering animals with. But they got much cleverer than that. 500,000 years ago in Britain, during the Paleolithic period, this is a very common type of tool that they would have made, and this is called a hand axe. That was a terrible name It is a terrible name for one of the most famous prehistoric tools, because as soon as we say the word axe, we imagine it fitted into a handle, and it never was. This was purely a handheld tool. So they would have held it like that, and they would have cut the meat using the tip of this tool. We very often see them in books and on the internet held like that. It's not a good idea. There's not really much use for that kind of cutting motion. That would have been much faster and much more effective. So, to make one of these tools, you have to be clever. Now, that might sound a little bit strange, because we've all seen prehistoric people in documentaries, on TV and on the internet and in books, and they always look just a little bit but they can't have been like that. We know they can't have been like that because lots of people, including myself, make replicas of their tools, and to make them properly we have to use the tools that they were using. So to make a flint hand axe, I used these. I've got a stone hammer, or what we would call a hard hammer, and a soft hammer, and this is a piece of deer antler. Now, we've found examples of these, and the most famous site in Britain, or one of the most famous sites in Britain, is Boxgrove in Sussex. And at that site they actually found 2 of these that were 500,000 years old. Amazing that they'd survived, but what was even more amazing is that when they examined the hammer, it still had tiny pieces of flint stuck in the hammer face, so we could see exactly what it had been used for. It was used as a flint-knapping tool. So we knew what tools they were using to work the flint, but it wasn't until we started to learn these skills that we realized just how clever they were, because without the use of angles and symmetry they wouldn't have been able to produce those tools. Now that doesn't really fit our ancestor, does it? I'm not suggesting they had a protractor at the back of the cave, because they certainly didn't. They weren't measuring angles, but they knew that by striking a piece of flint at certain angles they could take off different sized and shaped pieces. Now that gave them the control that they needed to shape a piece of flint to just the way they wanted it. Very sharp, serrated edges, perfect as a butchery knife. But we're going to start with a much simpler tool today. It is an introduction. It's my first YouTube video, incidentally, so I'm really nervous, so bear with me. I haven't done this before and it feels really weird. So, what I'm going to be aiming to make is one of these. This is what we would call a hide scraper. Now this was a very, very important tool to our ancestors, and we find these from all periods of prehistory. They didn't all look just like this, they weren't all perfectly symmetrical, but it's the type of edge that they were producing on a piece of flint. It's a fairly steep edge, it's not sharp, you can see that's not cutting my hand, but if I do this near the microphone, you can probably hear that rasping sound. This was just a tool designed to scrape, not cut. And it was so important because they were using these to scrape animal skins. Now, they must have been producing lots and lots of animal skins, because we find lots and lots of these tools. But that's maybe not surprising, because they were making their clothing, their shelters, their footwear, and anything that they would be wearing we could really compare to what they would be wearing today in cold conditions. So if you can imagine, they would have been making hats, they were probably making mittens. They would have needed really good footwear to walk in very cold, hard landscapes. Big thick coats, trousers. And it's quite interesting because again we see on TV our early ancestors wearing just kind of a Fred Flintstone costume. And that drives me mad. It really does. Because they couldn't have worn that. They would have frozen to death. They were also travelling very long distances, fairly frequently. So what they would have needed was tailored clothing, clothing made to fit. And for anybody that's ever walked a very long distance in clothing that's uncomfortable, it can make you a bit sore. So it wouldn't have taken them long to figure that out. They must have had clothing that covered all of their body to protect them from the intense cold, and it had to fit really, really nicely and be comfortable. So that really suggests that they were very, very clever. They were making very special outfits of clothing. They probably had travelling clothing and then clothing for doing everything else. So without this tool they wouldn't have been able to do that. This was used to scrape an animal skin nice and clean, and they could then process the animal skin so it didn't go all green and smelly every time it got wet. That was very important. Even prehistoric people probably didn't want to be smelly. So it would be used just as I'm holding it now, and used to scrape the skins nice and clean. They usually have these nice curved edges, and I think that's because when you have a skin stretched out, it's kind of like a trampoline. You have to press down very hard to use these tools so it would sink into the skin slightly. So that's using as much of the edge as it possibly can, and that's going to save time and energy. And I think they were quite big on saving time and energy. So what do I need to make one of those? Well, I've got my piece of flint here, and you can see I've already removed a flake. So I struck this with my hammerstone and took off this nice thick flake. It is quite thick actually, but we'll go with this one anyway. So I'm using a fairly small hammerstone, and what I'm going to do is just work around the edges. Now they don't take long. You can see I'm striking right past the piece of flint, right through it. And I'm removing as much of that chalky skin, in fact it's all gone. That was the last piece I think, because that doesn't give us a very strong edge. So I'm trying to expose as much of the flint as possible. Now if this does inspire any of you to have a go at this at home, please make sure that you wear eye protection. I'm not wearing it at the moment because I know all of the flakes are going straight downwards. But when you're learning to do this, it's not unusual to clip it on the way back up, and that can shoot sharp flakes up into your face. So please be safe. You're hearing that a lot recently, aren't you? Okay, so I've gone all the way around my piece of flint, but I don't know if you can see, we've got very sharp spikes all the way around where I've taken little notches. And they are very, very sharp, but they're not very strong. So what we can do is change the grip on the hammerstone, and all I'm going to do is slide the hammerstone over the edge to take off those little spikes. Very simple tools to make. In fact, this is one of the simplest tools. So what animals would our ancestors have been hunting? That's always a good question. Well, it depends on what period of prehistory we're talking about. If we're talking about the early Stone Age, so the Paleolithic period, that's when we would have seen our ancestors hunting the woolly mammoth, the woolly rhino, and the other big Ice Age animals. But in between the coldest parts of the Ice Age, we also had warmer periods. And because we were connected to the continent, we didn't have a sea separating us from the continent. We would see when it was very cold, we'd have the mammoth and the woolly rhino moving or migrating across into Britain. But when things warmed up, it got too warm for them. They wanted out, so they'd move back across into Europe. But because it was warmer, we'd see other animals coming in. And we had, during the warmer periods, animals that we would really associate with Africa today. We had the straight-tusked elephant, now extinct, but very similar to modern elephants, and hippos. Yes, we had hippos here in Britain. They've actually been found a lot of hippo bones in London, and the straight-tusked elephant too. So they were here, splashing around in the River Thames. But all of those animals would have been hunted. When we move into the later periods of prehistory, then we see the big megafauna, the mammoth, the rhinos. We see them start to become extinct. They start to dwindle in numbers. So our ancestors, realizing this, came up with new hunting skills so they could hunt smaller, faster moving animals. So that's when we see our ancestors start hunting horses and deer, and the bones of those animals have been found in excavations with cut marks on them, lots of cut marks. And that's where they were using the stone tools to cut the animals up so they could take the meat away and cook it. But the scratches on the bones were from the edges, the sharp edges of stone tools. Okay, so I've gone all the way around my hide scraper, and that's it. So you can see no sharp edges, but if I do this right next to the microphone, you can hear how that rasps across my skin. So that's a tool that would be able to scrape a whole cow skin nice and clean in an hour. And I use them to process animal skins all the time, and they work incredibly well. In fact, that would keep its edge longer than an iron tool, so they can still perform very, very nicely. So that's one of the simplest tools our ancestors would have been using, but they were making very complicated tools much, much earlier. And I've got a couple of examples here. I've already shown you the hand axe. It's not an easy tool to make, it takes lots of practice. I teach people to make these tools all the time, and people generally struggle. I did when I first started. But that's one of the tools, or the type of tool, that would have been made in Britain 500,000 years ago. If we follow back in time the movement of people from Africa across the rest of the world, because we're pretty sure we all started out in Africa. Well, that's a tool that would have been made in Africa closer to 1 million years ago. So it's been around for a very long time. So if we were ever visited by aliens, sounds good, doesn't it? If we were ever visited by aliens and they had to choose one tool to represent the whole human race, I think they'd choose this one, because we used this for longer than any other tool in our history. It was around for over 1 million years, and they work incredibly well. Very, very sharp, serrated edges, just like a steak knife, because that's what it was. It was a prehistoric steak knife, just used to cut up big animals. And I've got another one here as well, much prettier, thinner, and with a very characteristic shape. Now this is a tool that would have been made by Neanderthals. Now, for a very long time, Neanderthals have been really considered to be pretty dim. We now know that's not the case. Personally, I don't think they were any different to us at all, other than their shape, because this is a very difficult tool to make. And lots of the Neanderthal hand axes are actually thinner than ours. Now, thinning is one of the most difficult things to do with a piece of flint. So they were making thinner tools than us, they had a bigger brain than us, and we now know that they were talking to each other rather than just grunting at each other. I think they were pretty intelligent ancestors. So I think that's all we'll cover for this one. Hopefully the next one will be even better, because I'll have had a bit more practice. But this is all about showing you just how clever your ancestors were. So next time we'll cover some different tools from different periods, and I'll try and squeeze in as much information as I can. So thank you for watching, be safe and keep washing those hands.